I'm being stalked by the hollow out. At least, that's what I call it. I only became aware of it last year, and I might never have known if it wasn't for the old lady on the subway. A cartoonish rendition, really. Blue cotton dress, silver hair, a pale and wrinkled face framed by a headscarf. There was nothing that should have seemed out of place, and yet, the longer I looked, the more off she felt. We were the only two on the subway that night. The car was filled with an ominous green glow, complemented by an occasional flash of blue light from the tunnel outside. The old woman was sitting opposite me, several rows down, looking straight forward. Her head snapped in my direction and I suddenly looked at my feet, feeling awkward for staring. But after a few moments, I braved another sideways glance. Yes, there was something off about her. The way things just look off, even when you can't put a finger on it. Something about her face, the way it sagged in all the wrong places. Or perhaps it was the way it was pale and moist. All tricks of the lighting, I told myself. The overhead light cast wicked shadows from her features, deepening her eyes into sockets that seemed almost infinite. When the train slowed to an eventual stop, I felt relieved because I was beginning to creep myself out. The doors hissed open, and I moved past the old woman, refusing to look at her for fear of making it awkward again. A hand flew out and grabbed my wrist. She held me there for a moment, the two of us staring at each other. Her grasp was ice cold and clammy, but she held tight, almost painfully so. Her offness was no more discernible at this range, but there was a lumpiness to her face that didn't sit well with me. She raised a knobby arthritic finger toward the seat I'd just left. My wallet was over there. In my haste to leave, it must have fallen out of my pocket. "Oh, thank you," I said, my heart beating rapidly in my chest. At last, her cold clench relinquished and I retrieved my wallet from the seat. Stepping off the subway was like getting a breath of fresh air. It seemed 20 degrees warmer outside. When I looked back at the subway car, I expected to glimpse the old lady one last time, but she wasn't there. If she'd followed me out, I hadn't seen her. It wasn't until late that night, tossing and turning sleeplessly in bed, that I realized what had been the most unsettling about the old woman's face. There were harsh rims around her eyes. Her pale flesh became somehow different, as if her face had only been a mask, and the eyes peering out, bright and unknowing, belonged to another person. It sounded crazy at the time. After a week had passed, I convinced myself that the old woman's face had simply seemed strange in the creepy subway light. After a month, I'd reduced the experience to nothing more than my own late night chills. But just when I was beginning to forget the whole thing, the same oddities appeared in someone else. Mr. Morrison was the high school chemistry teacher. He was balding and old and had never been married, probably not by choice, but by his own ratty appearance. His face was dominated by glasses and a mustache. It was his class that my classmates dreaded the most because his lectures were near intolerable. His voice was monotonous, and I swear the clock on the wall slowed to a crawl in each chemistry period. On this particular day, though, Mr. Morrison was less talkative than usual. He hardly uttered a word, and when he did speak, it sounded different. It was unmistakably his voice, but there was a strain to it, as if something were tugging at his vocal cords, playing them like instruments, commanding them to work. Mr. Morrison's back was turned, and he spent most of the class copying our textbook onto the chalkboard. It wasn't the usual format of his class at all. When he talked, his movements were jerky and crooked. In the back of the class, Beth raised her hand and said, "Mr. Morrison, are you feeling okay?" "I'm just fine," he said. Each word sounded like it caused him a great deal of pain. "May I be excused?" I asked, having no intention of using the restroom. I wanted to get as far away from this class as possible. because just looking at Mr. Morrison was starting to make me feel sick. No, barked Mr. Morrison suddenly, aiming a curled finger at me. Stay after class, Michael. We need to talk. Behind his glasses, Mr. Morrison's eyes had the same mask-like appearance the old woman's had. There were circles around them, and the eyes inside were bright and uncanny. They were not Mr. Morrison's eyes. Yes, sir, I said softly, but as soon as the bell rang, I vanished into the crowd of exiting students and hurried out of the building. Instead of going to my next class, I waited for Mr. Morrison and followed him at a distance when he finally left the school. His legs twisted and limped as he walked, his feet turning inward or splaying to the side. He staggered like a zombie, fell against the building, straightened, and continued forward. I followed him along the side of the school and watched him disappear around the back. Where was he going? The parking lot was out front and there was nothing back there to interest him, or so it would seem. Peering around the corner, I saw something I will never forget until the day I die. At first, all I saw were dumpsters, and then I found him. Mr. Morrison was on the ground, but he was no longer the plump man he once was. He was deflated and hollow, a human husk, a sack of flesh that had been emptied of all bone, blood, and tissue. His eyes and mouth were gaping black holes that stared at me as though in a perpetual scream, as if whatever had been piloting his vacant body had crawled out and slithered away. There was no sign of the thing. The next thing I knew, I was running home as hard as I could. I had gotten about 2 blocks before my sides began to ache, and 3 before I was out of breath. When I couldn't run any longer, I paused on the sidewalk, hands on my knees, wheezing and gasping for breath. I looked over my shoulder, but no one was following me, which was good, I resolved, because my assailant could be anyone. This was the conclusion I'd come to in a mere 10 minutes after seeing Mr. Morrison. Assuming this thing had killed him and hollowed him out, it had crawled inside his body, either through his mouth or somewhere else, and operated his body like some sort of machine, like a Halloween costume. It had used his arms, legs, and even his vocal cords. It had been capable of forming words, which meant it was intelligent, and therefore dangerous. Of 2 things I was absolutely certain: that this creature could therefore become anyone, and that it was, for some unknowable reason, trying to get close to me. I had theories, of course. Perhaps, the first night on the train, it had sensed that I was scared and figured I knew what it was, so it decided I needed to be eliminated. Yeah, that was a likely theory. Or maybe, I thought with a shudder, I had unknowingly encountered it before and angered it in some way. I should have called the cops, but after I found Mr. Morrison's hollow corpse, the trauma was enough that I tried to forget the whole thing. His body was found the next day, and a closed casket funeral was held a few days later. After a month, I was still having nightmares of Mr. Morrison's gaping face hole staring right back at me. Even more disturbing was that the creature, a thing I called the Hollow Out, was nowhere to be found. You may think that's a good sign, but to me, it was nothing but prolonging the time I'd have to wait until our next encounter. I was sure it would turn up again, and after a month, I was tired of checking the eyes of my friends and family to make sure they were themselves. At any moment, I expected someone's mouth to drop open and birth some monstrous entity. The distance I put between myself and others began to put a damper on my social life. I spent long hours locked in my room, ignoring my mother's knocks on the door. I shied away from friends at school and flinched when anyone touched me. I ignored calls and texts and found comfort in my own solitude. I'd become something of a hermit and dreaded the day I would let my guard down long enough for the Hollow Out to get close to me again. That day finally came when I was walking home from school, as per usual, holding the straps of my backpack as I strolled along the sidewalk with my head down. And as I went, I heard this pattering, like plastic scraping the concrete. I turned to see a dog about 10 feet back, small claws clicking on the ground as he walked. He stopped when I did and sat patiently, staring at me and panting. He was a brown Labrador by the looks of it. Thinking such a small animal could be nothing more than harmless, I continued forward. The plastic clicking continued. I turned again and the lab stopped. Closer this time, tongue out, shoulders heaving. No, I said, purely annoyed that this dog was going to follow me home. Stay. Good dog. I continued walking, and had almost made it to the corner when I noticed the clicking again, uneven and drunk. I turned and found the dog directly behind me, no more than 3 feet away. He sat still, looking up at me, and that's when I noticed how strange he was. His body was lumpy, one ear crinkled, skin sagging in some places, but the eyes were bright and intelligent, almost human. There were circles around them where the dog's flesh met a tender redness, and I suddenly felt sure that the thing looking at me was no dog at all, but wearing one. That was when it smiled at me. I could have sworn it did, and I noticed the tongue hanging out of its mouth was all too long and pointy. The dog drooled and huffed, and when its mouth opened, the teeth inside were far too sharp. I turned on my heel and ran, but the clickety-clack of its feet was growing louder, gaining on me. There was an awful wet ripping noise, as if the creature decided its four-legged suit was too much of a hindrance, and it needed to be unrestrained to catch me. I didn't dare look back to see what this thing looked like. I ducked into an alley and scrambled up and over a chain-linked fence, and though I was sure I had lost it, I didn't stop running for a long time. It had done it, I thought. At long last. It found me. What followed was a series of encounters over the next few weeks, each more narrowly escaped than the last. I began to see the hollow out everywhere. The cashier lady at the grocery store, the mailman, a neighbor watering his lawn, a dental assistant, passerby on the street, kids at school I'd seen but never talked to. I encountered it so often that I began to wonder if there was more than one. But no, I concluded. I could sense that there was only one hollow out. My certainty was illogical, but those same blue eyes existed in every hollowed person. I started following obituaries in the newspaper. Shortly after each of my encounters, the hollowed person would turn up dead. The paper never mentioned it, of course, but I knew the bodies turned up deflated and empty, found by some unsuspecting person. My stalker switched bodies so often that it seemed he never used one for more than a day. All this death, just to get closer to me. What did it want from me? When would it end? Did it merely want to kill me? Or, I thought with a shudder, wear me like the rest? My paranoia had grown to such a degree that I boarded up my bedroom windows and latched my door shut with a deadbolt. I'd never owned a gun, so I kept a buck knife stored in my nightstand. Along with the microwave I'd installed in the corner, I hoarded cans of food and kept bowls and plates nearby. I'd also brought up 3 big jugs of water, probably meant for office coolers. I knew the supplies wouldn't last me forever, but I hoped it would be long enough to get my bearings. After skimming that day's obituary for yet another victim of the hollow out, I caught sight of myself in the full-body mirror on the back of my door. My hair was tangled, my eyes were baggy, sweat stains spreading on my shirt. It dawned on me just how stressful this had been. The whole ordeal was taking a toll on my mental and physical health. Next to me, my phone pinged, displaying the 47 unread messages I had in the past week. There was a soft knock at the door, so soft I almost hadn't heard it. "Michael, are you in there?" It was my mother's voice. I hesitated, then said, "Go away, I don't want to talk right now," from the other side of the door. "Michael, I'm worried about you. The schools called and said you weren't there again. What's going on?" There was a sniffle, which made my heart melt a little bit. "I wish I could tell you," I said, choking back my own tears. But I can't. I just can't explain what's going on right now. It's not safe. There was crying outside my door now. It was soft, but I could hear it. Could the hollow out mimic crying so well? I wondered. As clumsy as it was, I doubted so. Emotions getting the best of me. I decided it would be safe to open the door just a crack. Leaving the deadbolt latched, I opened the door until the chain was taut. It was dark in the house beyond, but I could clearly see my mother standing there. There were tears on her cheeks. "Oh, Michael," she said, "you look terrible." "I know I do," I said, and then we both stifled laughter, because I did look awful. It was a relieving human moment. She looked like herself. I unlatched the deadbolt and opened the door. She didn't lunge at me or tear me out of my skin. Instead, she said, "What on earth have you done to your room?" I wish I could tell you, but it wouldn't make any sense to you. Maybe someday, but not right now. I know this'll be over soon. What's happening right now is only temporary. I felt that what I said was true, but didn't mention that the situation might just end in my death. My mother examined the microwave, the boarded windows, the newspaper sprawled on the ground. Then she looked at me. "You know I'm always here for you, Michael. Whenever you need me. I know it's been tough without your father, but you can always talk to me whenever you need to." "I know, Mom." She wiped her nose and ran a hand through her blonde hair. "You're all grown up now. And handsome. You look just like him, your father. I don't understand what's going on with you right now, but we'll get through it together, okay? I'll always love you." She was moving toward me, bending to my level. "Do you love me too, Michael? Don't you love me too?" "Of course I do," I said. She was crying now, real tears that cascaded down her cheeks in streams. "Oh, oh, come here, sweetie." She leaned in and embraced me. I expected the worst, but it was just a hug. I felt myself relax a little. In my ear, she said, "Say you love your mother." "I love my mother," I said, but her eyes were never blue. I swung the buck knife forward into her shoulder. I'd been aiming for the chest but missed. She recoiled with a painful gasp, standing at full height and glaring at her wound. A crimson shape began to crawl outward from the knife, seeping through her shirt and dripping to the ground. Then she looked at me with tears brimming in her eyes. A look of horror and confusion plastered on her face. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something. Then she collapsed to the floor. There was nothing graceful about the way she fell. It was like a sack of bricks tumbling down. She sprawled on her stomach, head twisted to one side, limbs at crooked angles. There was a brief pang in my gut, brought on by a fear that I just committed matricide. It looked like her. It talked like her. I felt my stomach lurch with the sickening dread at the thought that it had been her all along. Had my paranoia finally gotten the best of me? Had I just killed my own mom? Her fingers began to twitch, and her body started to shudder, slightly at first. Then her arms and legs were thrashing, and her head was shaking back and forth. She crawled to her hands and knees, drooling and convulsing, eyes rolled in the back of her head, her slobber mixing with blood on the ground. She reached up, grabbed the hilt of the knife, and ripped it from her shoulder. Red spider-like appendages shot out of her back. The flesh suit of my mother crumpled away, and a raw, bloody thing rose upward, screeching an awful screech, a sound so loud that I clasped my hands over my ears and cringed. The creature was so horrifying to look at that I understood why it needed to hide itself in the bodies of others. There was something unnatural about seeing it out of a host, the way a crab or turtle must look like without its shell. The form reminded me of a mantis, but the eyes were human, bright and blue. I cowered in absolute horror, unable to look away. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. That was okay because the monster, wounded by the knife, had no interest in killing me. Instead, it smashed a boarded window, and though it was impossibly large, contorted itself through the hole. It had grown dark outside and the hollow out vanished into the night. Pulling myself back to my senses, I ran to the window. The creature had already gained much distance, scrambling awkwardly across the surrounding rooftops, leaping from house to house. When it finally disappeared from view, a final shriek of anger and pain echoed through the night. That was the last I saw of the hollow out, although I'm sure it will return. And though I'm living with my aunt and uncle, mourning the loss of my mother, I know that it is still out there somewhere, searching for me, contorting itself into bodies that are far too small, speaking with throats that are not its own, and peering out with eyes that do not belong, perfecting its talent until the mimicry is indistinguishable from the person. So, be careful. If the people around you start acting weird, if they look and sound off, you might be dealing with someone far more dangerous. I'm simply waiting now, waiting for it to return for one final showdown, in which one of us will die. I've got my uncle's shotgun, and I spend long nights pointing it at my bedroom door, waiting for the knob to turn. Until then, I'm being stalked by the hollow out. At least, that's what I call it. My name is Wyatt. I'm 21 now, but this story happened last winter when I was still 20. I'm an urban explorer and nature photographer. That's about as much detail as I'll go into about myself, because I don't want anybody coming after me if they find out what I've seen. I know I will never forget what I saw, but I can't risk telling anyone that I know. I'm not currently under any immediate danger, but there are far too many unknowns. Back in early December of last year, I was looking through Instagram and saw some shots from an abandoned factory in Germany. This place was so perfect. It was rusting and old, but still kept the same structure and shape as when it was in use. Some of the pictures were breathtaking. Mountain views through decrepit old windows, things like that. I screenshotted and reverse image searched one of the pictures from Instagram and found a place in Germany. There was no name for the factory anywhere I looked, but I kept seeing that it was in a town called Westchen. I looked it up on Google Earth and saw that it was in a mountainous region in northern Germany. As I swiped through the images on Google, one article stopped me. It claimed that the factory was going to be demolished in April of next year, meaning it would be gone in just a few months. I was feeling impulsive and excited, so without thinking, I Googled flights to Berlin. Looking back, I wish that my phone would have died at that very moment. Anything to stop me from looking at flights. I would do anything to go back and make me close that tab. However, I found one flight leaving from my airport that Wednesday. It was only $600. I was just about to buy the tickets when I remembered that my friend Bryce was looking for somewhere to go for winter break. So I called him up and told him that there were tickets to Berlin for only $600. I wish he would have talked me out of it, but instead, he was all over the idea. Later that afternoon, we both bought our tickets and planned to leave on Wednesday. Our friend Adrian was also coming with us, but was going to leave early on Saturday to go see his family in Poland. Me and Bryce made plans to go to Westchen on Sunday and look around there for a few hours. So when Wednesday came, I packed up all my stuff: camera lenses, SD cards, respirator, flashlight, and clothes, and met up with Bryce and Adrian. We took an Uber to the airport and quickly boarded the plane. Honestly, I don't remember most of the flight. I think I slept through most of it. But finally, we arrived in Berlin. Honestly, for the next few days, it was just a normal vacation. Nothing but sightseeing and doing basic tourist things. On Saturday, we said our goodbye to Adrian and he left for Poland. That night, I made sure to get all of my stuff ready for the next morning. We had a 2-hour car ride from Berlin to Westchen. I was hoping we would get there around 2 in the afternoon and explore there until about 8 that night. Playing it back in my head, I remember every little detail of that day. I remember the sound of my alarm, the excitement of waking up that day, the feeling of seeing all my stuff packed neatly on the floor next to my bed. We got up and had breakfast in the hotel lobby before walking to the car rental place. We picked out a blue Chevy from the lot, and the guy gave us the keys. I spent the next few hours driving through the green rolling hills of Germany until we finally got there. I felt nothing but excitement when we finally got into the town. I remember just driving and looking around for a while until we saw it there. Clear as day. The abandoned factory. It sat at the bottom of a tall hill, in the middle of a bright green field. The mountains were in the distance to the east opposite of the factory. I started looking on Google Maps for a good place to park in order for us to walk there. There was a large parking lot next to the self-storage place that was only about a quarter mile from the factory. I pulled into one of those spots and looked around for people. I think we should be good, I told Bryce as we got out of the car. I grabbed my camera bag, my flashlight, and my respirator out of the back seat and put it all on. For those of you who don't know, a lot of old buildings were built with toxic materials like asbestos, so it's just safer to not even risk it and wear the respirator. We began walking down this old asphalt road that has grass flowers growing through it. It led straight to the factory, which I remember finally having a good view of. It was brown and rusted, but still beautiful and majestic. It had plants growing in it like it had been retaken by nature after the people left it. After a little walking, we reached a tall chain-link fence that was locked, but there was no barbed wire on top, so I considered just jumping it. But instead, I decided to look for an easier way. After walking next to the fence, I saw part of it had been knocked down from the metal frame by someone else. We pushed the metal out of the way and just crawled through it onto the other side. Now, we just had to get into the factory. It was already clear to me that the main entrance wasn't an option. It probably had motion sensors anyway. I was looking around when I spotted it, a broken window. It was only about 10 feet off the ground, so I asked Bryce to help me up. He hoisted me up and I grabbed onto the windowsill. I pulled myself up and through the window frame, pushing aside the broken glass as I did so. I pulled Bryce up through the window, and we both jumped down onto the ground inside the factory. Now, when I say this thing was massive, I mean massive. Like probably the biggest single room I have ever seen. It had so many levels and catwalks and bridges. This place was a gold mine. I immediately got out my camera and put on my 16 by 35 lens and my best flash. I also put in a new SD card just in case. We walked around the ground floor a bit, mostly just looking up at the ceiling. I took one picture of all the catwalks and bridges, leading up to a crack in the ceiling letting sunlight through. We went up one of the staircases onto the second level. There were a ton of generators and turbines all over the place, with a thick layer of dust and rubble covering them. I took a few pictures on this floor, but we quickly moved up to the next. It was more of the same stuff, but still beautiful. I walked to the edge of the floor and looked over the small balcony-like platform we were on. I immediately felt dizzy, looking all the way down to the ground level. I'm used to that kind of stuff. I just didn't realize how high up we were. We climbed up the stairs to the next floor, when Bryce told me to look at the mountains out of the window. That was the shot from Instagram that I wanted. I adjusted my settings and snapped the shot. I checked over them just to make sure it was as good, because that's pretty much the reason I came here. Even though I'm explaining all of this very quickly, we spent hours wandering around this place and looking at every little detail. We eventually got to some sort of control room. It must have had hundreds of different switches and buttons, all labeled with German words that I couldn't read, or seemingly random numbers. It was made clear from the thick layer of dust that this stuff probably hadn't been used in decades. That being said, I know I shouldn't have done this, but I took a small silver key from the control room as a souvenir. We left the control room, and I saw a ladder that went up at least 2 stories. It led straight up onto the roof of the factory. I hesitantly decided to climb it. Bryce said he'd do it if I did it first. The ladder wobbled from side to side as I hesitantly climbed up the steel bars. Finally, I grabbed onto the roof and pulled myself onto it. "You'll be fine if you go slow," I yelled down at him. Soon, he joined me up on top of the roof and we looked out to the rest of the world. It was just endless rolling green hills leading to the snow-capped mountains. I turned around and looked behind us. I realized that the hill behind us was taller than the factory itself. If we could get to that hill before sunset, the picture would be unbelievable. I really wish I had just abandoned the idea. But instead, we rushed back down the ladder and all the staircases to the ground level. We quickly leapt out of the window and crawled through the fence. We walked across the grassy green fields and slowly walked up that tall green hill. I won't lie, it was tiring walking all the way up that hill, racing the sunset. When we finally got there, it was totally worth it. The factory, the mountains, and the sunset all mashed together in this beautiful vista. I took out my tripod and lined up the composition. When I finally snapped the shot, I took 9 or 10 of the exact same picture, just to make sure I got it. It was incredible, but if I could, I would go back in time and leave that hill immediately. But unfortunately, Bryce looked behind us and pointed out another abandoned building to me. It was smaller, made of brick rather than steel. He was hesitant to go down there and check it out, because it was getting late. I assured him we would be fine with the flashlights, and that we wouldn't be long. We walked back down the other side of the hill, and over the dilapidated brick building. By the time we got there, it was getting pretty dark already, but we had flashlights that worked fine. The only weird thing was that when we walked up to it, the gate was unlocked, like they weren't even trying to keep people out. I guess it was pretty hard to find, but still, we walked straight through the gate. I was scanning the area for motion sensors or alarms, but there was nothing. The same exact thing when we got to the front door. No lock, no bar, nothing. We moved open the metal door, but it was heavy. Hard for either of us to even move. We entered the building and it was dark. Super dark. I immediately had to turn on my flashlight to even be able to see. The building looked more of the same. Catwalks, machines, and overall the same vibe. But there was a large circular door directly in front of us. It looked more like the entrance to a bank vault than any other normal door you would find. At this point, I was stunned that we hadn't seen a single alarm or motion sensor in this place. We were both immediately drawn to the vault door. I put my hand on it in awe. I had never seen anything like this in all the places I've explored. It was barely cracked open. Not open all the way, but definitely not closed. I put my hand in between the door and wall and tried to pry it open. It slowly moved open, showing us what was inside. There was a long circular tunnel that just led to another room. So far, this was looking like one of the best finds for me ever. I took multiple pictures looking down that long hallway, the flash lighting up the area. We slowly walked down the hallway, flashlights in hand as we advanced towards the room at the end. When we got to the end of the hallway, there was another vault door that was swung all the way open. We walked through the open door into the room. It was seemingly empty, except for a small hatch leading into the ground. It was closed, but the lock and chain on it were broken. Above it, there was an arrow pointing at the hatch that said, Project Notchwolfen. At the time, I had no idea what it meant. I didn't even take a second to put it into Google Translate. Nowadays, the words still sent a chill down my spine. Project Nightwolf. A phrase that sounds like nothing, But if you had seen what I've seen, you wouldn't be able to hear those words without shuddering. I slowly opened the hatch, the hinges squeaking as I did so. I flipped it all the way over until it was on the other floor. I shined my flashlight down the hatch to reveal what looked like just a normal staircase. We began slowly descending down the stairs. As we got closer to the bottom, you could hear the drops of water hitting the floor and making a quiet sound. I was going first, ahead of Bryce, so I saw it first. A room that was all pitch black. About 2 inches of water lining the whole floor came into my sight. What horrified me were the piles of animal skeletons and bones lying in the water, small rodents that had been mutilated, and sheep that had been torn apart. Some were just the skeletons, but others still had decaying, rotting flesh, but it looked like they had been ripped apart, some of them torn perfectly in two. I struggled to hold back my vomit as the smell hit me. I was firing off my camera flash, taking pictures all around us, when I spotted another door just ahead of us. I remember Bryce telling me that we should just leave, but I wanted to get to that last door. The room was made out of cement. Stone pillars sat around the room, although some of them looked like they were about to collapse. We finally got to the door and I opened it. It looked just like another control room, like the ones in the factory. The thing that was different, though, was there were swastikas on a lot of the equipment and walls. Not ones that had been spray painted by some kids, but real-looking ones. It was as if this place hadn't been touched since World War II. I looked around at some of the buttons and stuff until I saw a journal. I opened it to find that, unsurprisingly, it was in German, but I stuffed it in my pocket to take home. Just then, I heard the sound of broken glass, not like somebody dropping a wine glass, but like an entire window just shattered all at once. I immediately turned off my flashlight, and Bryce slammed the door behind us. We both knelt down, breathing as silently as possible, not wanting to know what that sound was. Thoughts rushed through my head, possibly a bird, a mountain lion, but neither of those were even possible. We sat in that room for about a full minute, until I realized it was probably just because of how old this room was. Some structural error or rotting metal probably caused it. I worked up enough courage to go out there. Bryce said that he would go if I opened the door first. I walked over to the door, still crouched on the ground, and I turned the handle. I slowly creaked the door open, and as if we were in a horror movie, my flashlight died. I was too committed at this point to go back, so I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my camera and started blindly firing off the flash. I could only do it about every 3 seconds, but I slowly creeped further and further out into the room, and that's when I saw it. It looked like a shadow crouched on the ground, but about 10 feet away from me was this oily black skeleton-like creature. It slowly stood up, making cracking and crunching sounds as it did so. Its limbs snapped back and forth like they were breaking. When it finally got all the way up, I saw its mangled set of razor-sharp teeth, lining a huge gash in its face. It was almost 9 feet tall with its head almost hitting the ceiling. It was holding the body of a fox in its lanky, disgusting arms. It ripped the fox into two, as it let out a horrifying, ear-piercing screech. My flash stopped firing. I looked down at my camera to see the message. SD card full. I quickly grabbed the one in my pocket and switched them out. But when I fired the flash again, the creature was gone. Had I just imagined it? I felt paralyzed, when suddenly it grabbed me by the neck. Its hands felt wet and sharp as it pulled me towards it. Bryce immediately ran for the door, and I don't blame him for it. I was panicked. No rational thoughts ran through my brain except one: survive. As I was brought closer to its face, I grabbed my pocket knife from my right pocket and plunged it deep into the neck of the creature. It dropped me and let out a horrifying scream. My camera smashed on the floor, and I felt Bryce grab my arm and pull me up. We ran for the door and slammed it behind us. We could still hear it screaming and screeching as we ran up the stairs. When we got up the stairs and above the hatch in the floor, I tied the chain around the lock, hoping to give us more time. After that, we just sprinted back to our car. It was pitch black by that point, so we got into the car and sped off and didn't look back for a second. It was a very silent car ride back to the airport. We got on an earlier flight back home and left that night. We didn't talk about what happened until we got back home. I didn't leave my room for the rest of that winter break. If it weren't for the journal and the pictures, I would have thought that I dreamt it. But no, the pictures showed the disgusting creature exactly how I remembered it. I'm actually glad I switched out SD cards, or I would have no pictures of it. I won't post any of the pictures here, mainly because I don't want people finding this place and making the same mistake I did. But I will post a section from the journal that I was able to translate. Most of the journal is illegible, but I could still make out this small section. Our tests haven't been getting better. It has become even more violent, no longer eating the rabbits, but just tearing them apart. Nobody here wants to get in the cage with it anymore, because of the fact that it seems to find joy in destroying the animals. Also the screaming. I will not forget the screaming until the day I die. March 24th, 1942. I've always been overly protective of my daughter Charlotte. As soon as I laid my eyes upon her for the first time, I knew I would do anything and everything to keep her safe from harm. With that being said, I hope that you can understand why I'm doing this by the end of my story. 2 days ago, on Wednesday evening, I sent my daughter out of the house. The tail of her black cat costume bounced as she ran down the driveway to meet her friends, who patiently waited on the sidewalk. Charlotte had just recently turned 13. She was a teenager now. My wife, Samantha, had always been a bit more open to letting our daughter live her own independent life. Sam, with Charlie's help, convinced me that she was ready to travel around the neighborhood on her own for Halloween. I wanted to keep my daughter safe, yes, but I'd always been conscious of how overbearing I could be. In an attempt to make up for my overprotective tendencies, I agreed with them this year. We lived in a great neighborhood anyway. I had nothing to worry about. In our town this year, trick-or-treating occurred on the night before Halloween, October 30th. It was a last-minute decision by those who were in charge of that kind of thing. A massive rainstorm was coming through the night of Halloween. The storm would have ruined the holidays for these kids. So I'm glad that Charlie got to have the experience while she could. Sam and I sat on our front porch, waiting patiently for another child to make their shy journey up our driveway. "It looks like it's going to rain tonight after all," Samantha said, leaning forward looking up at the sky. "Charlie's been out for almost an hour now," I said, glancing at my watch. "Even if it does rain, I imagine she won't be that disappointed." Sam scoffed, shrugging. "It's like you don't even know your own daughter," she said, laughing. "That girl can down candy like it's nothing." I smiled, turning my attention to the end of the road. A small boy, no more than 4 years old, waddled around the corner, his body surrounded by a large pumpkin costume. His parents walked slowly behind him, chatting quietly as their son moved down the road. "God, will you look at him?" Sam said, a pang of sadness in her voice. "He's so fucking adorable, Ryan." I smirked. "We could make a hell of a pie out of him." Sam ignored the joke, turning towards me. "We should have another kid, Ryan." I sighed softly, sitting up in my chair. We'd had this conversation many times before, but several months had passed since we'd last talked about it. "Don't you think it's a little late for that? I mean, if the gears are still turning," she started, shrugging. I don't see why we shouldn't. It's just, Charlie is getting old so fast. She'll be gone soon. You still have plenty of time, Sam, I said, rubbing my wife's arm slowly. She's not going to college tomorrow, you know. Sam hummed softly, looking out towards the driveway. The little boy was moving up our yard, his bucket of candy in hand. The boy began to walk slower than before as he noticed that he was being watched. Wow, look at you, Sam said, leaning forward in her chair as the boy approached. The parent smiled politely at my wife as the boy stood, silent. What do you say, Lukey? The mother said, looking down at her son. Trick or treat, the boy said, hardly getting the words out. Well, we just gave out our last trick, Sam said, repeating the same joke she'd used most of the night so far. So, I guess we'll just have to give you a treat then. The little boy smiled, stepping towards me. I leaned forward, holding the large orange bowl of candy out towards him. His tiny hand reached into the bowl, taking out a single fun-sized Snickers bar. The pumpkin took a step back, dropping the candy into his pail. Oh no, Sam said, laughing. You have to take more than that. The boy looked back at me for a moment before stepping forward once more, reaching back into the bowl. I couldn't help but smile as the boy began to rummage through the candy. He clearly had his favorites. Footsteps sounded from up the street. It sounded as if someone was running. Sam looked up at the parents from the chair, starting a conversation as the boy continued to pick through the candy. My eyes moved down the road as the footsteps grew nearer. Charlotte was running down the street towards our house, her pillowcase in hand. I was on my feet within the next second. The boy stared up at me in confusion as I set the bowl on the table next to me. Charlie, what's wrong? I called out, ignoring the staring eyes of the parents to my left. My daughter ran up our yard, clearly in distress. The eye makeup that her and her mother had worked on just a few hours earlier was now running down her cheeks, black tears staining her pale skin. Charlie ran up to me, throwing her arms around my waist. Sam was now standing, confusion in her eyes. Charlie? I repeated, rubbing my daughter's back. What happened? Charlie took a step back, rubbing at her eyes. I just got scared. I couldn't help but become slowly angry. Why? Was someone messing with you? No, Dad, she said, shaking her head. I don't know. Sam stepped forward, standing beside me. You can talk to us, honey. What happened? Charlie sighed, looking nervously at the family on our driveway as they began to walk away. There was a man at one of the houses. Okay, what did he do to you? I asked, just about ready to go inside and grab my gun. Nothing, she said, wiping away her tears once more. He just told us a scary story. That's all. Sam nodded, sighing softly. Well, you're safe, Charlie. It's just a story, honey. Who was it? I asked, nodding slowly. Sam placed a hand on my arm, attempting to calm me down. It was that old guy, she said, shrugging. The one who moved in, like, a week ago. I clenched my teeth. All right. Well, I'm going to have a talk with him. Charlie began to chew on her lip as Sam shook her head. It's fine, Ryan. Don't bother. It's Halloween. You're supposed to tell scary stories, she said, looking towards our daughter. And it's just fine that you got scared, honey. Scary stories aren't for everyone. No, I'm going, I said, shaking my head. Who makes a little girl cry like that? Dad, it's fine, Charlie said, sighing. It was just a stupid story. I'm okay. Don't worry, Charlie. I just want to talk to him. That's all. Charlie rolled her eyes, heading towards the front door. Well, I'm not going back there, she said, pushing open the door. That guy is creepy. I remained outside with Sam for a moment, rubbing my chin. Ryan, you don't have to bother with doing this, Sam said, sighing. You saw her, Sam, I said, pointing towards the door. That creep should have known what was too far before she ever got to that point. Sam nodded slowly, seemingly accepting that I wasn't going to give in. Well, I'm coming with you then, I grunted, already beginning to walk out towards the street. I'd already made up my mind anyway. I knew exactly which house Charlie had been talking about. The man had only moved in 5 days ago. I knocked on the front door of the man's house, glancing over my shoulder at Sam. My wife looked slightly nervous. I didn't blame her. I usually kept my temper under control, to give myself some credit, but some people just rubbed me the wrong way. There wasn't much I could do about that. The door slowly creaked open. An older man stood in the doorway, his scalp almost completely bald. His skin was extremely wrinkled and looked as if it were dry. The man had certainly not aged well. "You seem a bit too old to be looking for candy." The old man smiled. I ignored his joke. "Hey, did my daughter come through here earlier?" The man frowned. "I'm afraid I don't know who your daughter is, sir." I nodded. "She wore a cat costume. You told her a story, apparently," I said, narrowing my eyes. "She just came home to me crying." The old man sighed, turning away briefly. "Ah, yes," he said, nodding. "She did come by." "What's wrong with you?" I asked, crossing my arms. "Why would you think it's okay to make a girl cry like that?" Sam placed her hand on my arm as the old man stared into my eyes. "I didn't know that the girl would cry. I'm truly sorry." "What did you tell her anyway?" I asked, moving Sam's hand gently away. I was calm. The man laughed softly before sighing. I imagine you wouldn't want to hear the story." "No, you're going to tell me," I said, taking a step forward. I was calm. The man stared at me for a moment before speaking. "I told your girl a story that my family has been telling for years, centuries even." I nodded, leaning against the wall. "Well, get on with it then." The man nodded, clearing his throat. "In a small town out in the middle of the country, a few hundred years ago, there lived a young boy and his friend. The boy and his friend liked to play out in the woods outside of town, fighting one another with sticks or swimming in the river." I listened intently, feeling Sam as she stepped up beside me. The man continued. "One day, the two of them heard a rattling somewhere out in the woods. The friend turned to the boy and said, 'I think I just heard a deer.' The boy turned to his friend and said, 'No, I think it was a dog.' I turned to Sam, frowning. "You're sure this is the story you told my daughter?" The old man ignored my question. "The boy and his friend began to argue, eventually deciding that they would move deeper into the woods in an attempt to find the source of the noise." Sam smirked, seemingly amused by the man's story. "What did they find then?" "Deep in the woods, the boy and his friend found a man," he said, a disturbing smile crossing his face. "He was quite unlike any man the two had ever seen before. He stood nearly 8 feet tall and wore dark clothing that covered every inch of his skin. A hood shielded his head from view. No matter how hard the boys looked, no matter how close they moved, they could never make out the man's face." I hated to admit it, but the man's story was beginning to make me feel uneasy. "Why were you saying this to my daughter?" "The man is good, my friend," the old man said, smiling. "Let me finish my story first, please." I nodded, sighing loudly. The old man spoke. "The man introduced himself to the boys and explained his situation. The man is tall. He needs to eat. Once a day, the man picks a name from the list and travels to their home. When his meal is not looking, he sneaks into their home and hides under their bed. When the meal falls asleep, the man makes a small cut in the meal's skin and sucks the blood from their body." I frowned, disgusted. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" The man continued to smile. "You don't like the story?" "You're fucking sick." I said, shaking my head. In what world is that a good story to tell a kid? Ours, he said, his eyes unblinking. Don't you want to know how he makes his list? Sam groaned, unsettled. Ryan, let's just go. Please? The man adds those who hear his name to his list, the old man said, his grin growing even wider. No, Sam, I said, looking back at my wife. This guy needs to understand that what he's doing is wrong. Would you like to hear his name? The old man asked. His eyes locked on to the back of my head. I turned back to the man, my hand held up. Enough with your story. They call him the Bloodletter, the old man said, beginning to laugh. The man was starting to piss me off. Is this fucking funny to you? I asked, taking another step forward. Is making a little girl cry funny to you? The old man didn't respond. His laughing cut off by a pained fit of coughing. Without another word, I reared back my fist and punched the man. Sam gasped behind me as the old man fell to the floor. The man grunted in shock as he hit the ground before falling back into a fit of laughter. I shook my hand slowly, groaning. Let's go, Sam, I said, avoiding my wife's eyes as we walked down the man's driveway. Charlie was watching TV in the living room when we got home. The three of us ate a late dinner and headed to bed. Charlie still had school the following day. I kissed my wife goodnight, and that was that. I woke up the next day, hollowing morning, to find Sam dead next to me. Her neck had been slashed open. No blood stained the bedding around her corpse. Her skin was paler than it used to be. My poor, beautiful Sam. The first thing I did was check on Charlie. She was, and is okay. Thank God. The police found the old man's house to be empty. There are apparently no records of anyone having lived there within the past year. The smart ones among you may have already noticed what I have done. If so, I'm so sorry that it had to be this way. If you still have yet to realize what I've done, I'll spell it out for you. You've now heard the man's story. You now know the man's name. Maybe I'm just losing my mind. Perhaps that piece of shit I talked to on Wednesday was the one who killed my wife. But I can't stop thinking about his story. Do you want to die? No, of course not. No, I want Charlie to live. And it seems that the more people that know of this man's story, the better her chances are of surviving. You are now on the man's list of names. So am I. So is my daughter. And so is the name of every other user who has listened to this story. So, what now? How do you increase your own chance of survival? Tell the man's story to those you know, to those you hate, to those you love, to those you don't know. I couldn't give a fuck, really. I just want Charlie to be okay. I hope you can forgive me. This isn't personal. I don't know your stories. I don't care about who you are or what you've done. To me, you're just a name that lowers my daughter's chances of being murdered by this bloodletter. I'm taking Charlie far away from here. I'm not going to mention where. I'm beginning to fear that there is no point in trying to run. It's only a matter of time before the bloodletter reaches Charlie's name. I don't even know how his fucking list works. For all I know, Charlie and I are next. Maybe I've killed you all for nothing. Who knows, really? Please, share this story with as many people as you can, or as many people as you want to. Hell, I don't even mean this YouTube video specifically. Tell them the story. Tell them his name. If I'm lucky, the bloodletters list will grow. If I'm lucky, maybe I can put off Charlie's death by a few years. It's only been 24 hours since I found my wife's corpse, and I've already told almost 100 people this story in person. That's potentially another 100 days of life for my daughter. That is, of course, unless the bloodletter picks randomly. I hope I've made you understand why I've done this to you. I hope you will join me in spreading his story. I'm so fucking sorry. I've always been a bit off. I grew up with my grandparents in the outskirts of St. Gall, Minnesota. You can call them hippies if you want. They were emotionally distant people. I could tell they weren't very close with their child, my mother, and they weren't happy with her decision to have me. Honestly, most of the parenting I got were from the other residents of St. Gall, this close-knit community of outsiders. And my parents? Well, I've never met them. My mother is in jail, possibly for life. Not sure why, but seeing as my dad is dead, I have my suspicions. Honestly, though, they've never been a part of my life, and I'm not going to start caring now. But I'm here to tell you about one of my most private and weird personal problems. Because of recent events, I've grown a bit existential. I thought it was about time I shared my story. My grandparents told me I had a skin disease, something that could transfer from one person to another if I wasn't careful when spending time with others. They had all kinds of fancy Latin words for it, and statements from dermatology specialists. Looking back at it, I should have asked a lot more questions. I figured out it was nonsense by age 7. Either way, I was told to stay away from people and keep to myself. I had to wear gloves at the dinner table, and there were no hugs and kisses. Instead, I'd get a steady gloved handshake when I did something good, and I was sent to the basement when I did something bad. The basement had no books, which was punishment enough. Just a dark room where I was left to stew on my anxieties. During my formative years, I was homeschooled. I noticed that I kept surprising people with my ability to retain, observe, and use information. While my grandparents might quiz me on European history, for example, I not only knew the answers perfectly, I could discuss them, challenge them, and see patterns from other textbooks I'd read. They kept calling me a smart kid, but I've never really felt smart. I just see things and remember them. If that's all there is to being smart, then it's not that big a deal. Trust me. But it came to a point where I could no longer ignore it. People in the community came to me for help, and I started picking up foreign languages. I learned fluent Spanish watching Telemundo, and a lot of German from documentaries about the Second World War. Today I speak 8 languages fluently. But being intelligent, whatever that means, is not just a boon. You're constantly second-guessing yourself, asking if there's a better answer. You're worried you don't have all the pieces to a puzzle. Answers and the questions that precede them, they're never good enough. There is always another step to take, another angle to consider. Imagine being wrecked by constant doubt and insecurity. It leaves a mark on a person, and I'm no exception. I pretty much withdrew from people. I couldn't imagine myself trying to help others. What if I guided them wrong? What if they took an unwittingly false statement as fact? It's exhausting trying to be on the right side of knowledge and opinion. I was constantly on edge, withdrawing from St. Gall to focus on myself. I learned to find comfort in nature, mostly from a friend I made as a kid. It was an early morning in May, and the air was still thick with dew. I took a walk around the lake when I noticed this awful cry. The couple had been setting up fox traps to protect their chickens, and something was stuck. I hurried over. At first, I thought it was a small dog, but the shape of the paws were all wrong. Taking a closer look, I realized I was looking at a baby black bear. The mother was nowhere to be seen, and the little thing was screaming its heart out. I felt awful, but as I approached, it lashed out towards me. I tried to calm it down, and the strangest thing happened. The moment I put my hand on its forehead, it just stopped screaming. The little animal just stared at me, confused. Those big dark eyes locked onto mine, and I could tell it knew my intention. It knew I meant it no harm. I'm sure of it. It was just scared, confused, and in terrible pain. "I'll help you," I whispered. "You'll be fine." I made a mental checklist of all the things I needed. It might require stitches, bandages, maybe even a splint. I had to check if the leg was broken or merely sprained. It could be dehydrated, starved, or even sick. I didn't see any signs of mange or other diseases, so I just pet the animal, whispering comfort. "I'll be right back." As I stepped away, it didn't panic. It knew I'd be back. I raided our first aid kit and spent most of the day caring for it. I didn't bring it back to the house, as I wanted the mother to have a chance to find it. Instead, I cleaned it, cared for it, and kept it company. The leg wasn't broken, but there was a deep gash. The bear also had a limp when he walked, understandably. I figured it might be permanent. Still, it seemed calm in my presence. In a way, I felt a connection to it. We understood one another in a way that people usually didn't. I listened. He leaned against me and slept as I practiced my Mandarin. I called him Wojtek, like the bear the Polish 22nd Artillery Supply Command adopted during the Second World War. I spent 4 days with Wojtek that summer. Every night, I'd tuck him in next to a large rock so no wild animals would find him. And every morning I'd bring him eggs, toast, and bacon. My grandparents usually let me eat in my room alone, so they didn't notice me sneaking out to share my dinner. At the night of the 4th day, I tucked in Wojtek. I heard this rumbling noise, a tree breaking. The sun was setting, and I didn't even notice the black shadow flanking me. I turned around and realized I was facing a fully grown black bear, and I was standing between her and her cub. As she stood up on her hind legs, I remembered thinking that I didn't even have the time to panic. I almost laughed. My death would be so sudden I didn't even have a chance to regret my actions. I froze, looking at those enormous claws, the jaws large enough to swallow my head. As she roared, I could feel my body collapsing to the ground. I thought I'd die from the sound alone. Then I noticed Wojtek. He'd stepped out and placed himself between me and his mother. He stood up on his little legs, making this tiny yelp noise over and over. It almost looked like he tried to mimic me, even though it pained him to stand on his wounded leg. I just crawled into a ball and made myself as small as possible. Over and over, I heard Wojtek screaming at his mother. The air grew silent, like that feeling you get before a lightning strike. I held my breath as I heard the trees bending and breaking. Looking up, I saw Wojtek limping into the woods, following his mother away from St. Gall. I don't speak bear, but I'll tell you, Wojtek saved my life. I'm sure of it. That summer, I started spending a lot more time with animals. There was something so relieving about being understood without having all these expectations looming over me. Animals are so simple, and so grateful for so little. I started spending more time downtown, helping out at the animal shelter and the veterinary clinic. I knew my grandparents wouldn't approve of me spending too much time around other people, so I just told them I was at the library, which wasn't entirely untrue. I borrowed a lot of books on the anatomy of common domesticated animals. I can clearly remember the first time I helped feeding the dogs at the shelter. They'd bark and growl, but as soon as I stepped into the room, they just stopped, all those little eyes turning to me, staring, as if they wondered what the hell they were even looking at. They were already listening to me, trying to figure me out. They knew I was there to help. When I was 16, my grandparents died. They died within 3 months of one another, and I was left with an inheritance I didn't know what to do with. I invested most of it, sold the house, and moved into a small apartment downtown. By now, I was a de facto and unlicensed veterinarian. Nearby farms would sometimes call me up and give me something off the books for my help. I can't count the amount of cows and goats I've treated. Most of the farmers called me Dr. Charming. You know, as in Prince Charming. similar to a Disney princess. I used my inheritance to pay for my college studies. My investments also paid off handsomely, allowing me some greater luxuries. I got my VMD degree ahead of schedule from MSU. I can honestly say that it was easier than I expected, and I started to realize that many of my fears were exaggerated. I still lived largely separated from other people, though, and I didn't have many friends. I had a few acquaintances, and most of the nearby farmers knew me by name, but that's not really what I'd call a relationship. As I turned 20, I decided I would make a conscious effort to be more social and face my fears. I had known for years that I didn't really have a contagious skin condition. That lie wasn't really all that held me back. Honestly, I just felt like a freak. I'd get lost talking to other people, and it would be exhausting trying not to correct them. Instead, I just hold my tongue and stick to subjective topics: music, film, literature, favorite actor, that sort of thing. It was during an after-work event with the others from the vet clinic that I first met Veronica. I was an unkissed, unloved, and insecure virgin at the time. Veronica took a liking to me, amazed by the amount of random nonsense I could dig out of my brain. She described it as having an unlimited flower bed of trivia she could make bouquets from. I'd never heard anything like that. While our first meeting was short-lived and awkward, our following 4 dates went by like a charm. We'd go for long walks and she'd ask me all sorts of questions. "Isn't it funny?" she'd say. "You could literally be a rocket scientist, but you can't pick up on sarcasm." One thing led to another, and we started dating. Veronica was the charming and outgoing ice pick I needed to break out of my shell, and to this day, I credit her with what little social experience I have. She was warm, understanding, and had no trouble explaining social cues I might have missed. It didn't take me too long to get the hang of it, and soon I could hold my own in a conversation with her friends. But things weren't perfect. After about a month, I remember waking up in the middle of the night to find her sitting at the edge of the bed, crying hysterically. She'd hold her face in her hands, shivering and unblinking. I'd never seen her do that before. As I held her, she just started speaking nonsense. "None of it matters," she'd say. "We're nothing but walking wheat, broken clocks. We're useless, fragile, and so insignificant." I tried to calm her down, but it was impossible. We'd sit for hours, and she'd just spew these horrible existential anxieties. She'd have these mental breakdowns every now and then, several times a week, and she started recoiling from my attempts to comfort her. I made her feel this awful dread. "It just feels like you're going to tell me something awful," she explained. "You're in my head, and I want you out." It worried me how much she reflected on my own anxieties, and it was clear I was making her unhappy. My worst thoughts were coming out of her mouth, so we broke up. That relationship lasted a few months in total, but I couldn't get over it. The way I'd turned her from this happy-go-lucky and independent woman to a nervous wreck, it made me feel like an abuser. I had no idea what was even going on, and I couldn't tell what was wrong with me. I heard from a friend of a friend that she started taking Xanax and going to therapy. I'm not sure what I think about her therapist, Dr. Bogan. That woman gives me the creeps. Back then, I spent a lot of time with my work colleague turned friend, Jacob. He was a few years older than me and had just gotten his own VMD. He had seen a lot of the strangeness I brought to the clinic, and he was one of the few who didn't seem to mind or question it. He had this amazing laugh that could easily break any tension. I remember this one night we spent at a bar, about after a week after my breakup with Veronica. It was one of the first times I had got really drunk. That bottle of blueberry wine felt like stepping on a goddamn landmine, and my shell just cracked wide open. I'd gush about how amazing she was, how she made me feel, how beautiful she was. I'd quote love poems by Burns and Keats. laugh, cry, and finish most of the bottle on my own. At the time, Jacob was nothing but supportive. He'd pat me on the back, he'd make sure I drank plenty of water, and he'd ask me all kinds of follow-up questions. He just wanted me to get it all out. He actually told me it was nice to see me act all human for once. At the end of the night, he helped me get back home. Before we parted ways, I gave him this big hug, and he just froze. 2 weeks later, I found out he and Veronica had started dating. Out of nowhere, he just started courting her. She'd appreciated the attention, and the two had gotten along. Jacob was absolutely smitten by her, and she had found someone willing to overlook and tolerate her exhausted mental state. The two of them just turned into this natural couple, like I'd never been a part of the equation. Honestly, it kind of pissed me off. I quit my job and moved to the next town over. They, on the other hand, got married. I wasn't even invited to the wedding. For a few years, that's been my life. I've been keeping to myself and spending time with the local wildlife. I've taken a few trips to Europe and reinvested my winnings. I've had a few short relationships with a handful of women, but as soon as I saw a hint of what happened to Veronica reflect in their behavior, I just had to leave. I left a trail of broken hearts, and after a while, I just stopped trying to justify it. I was being selfish. I couldn't keep hurting people just to get over my own insecurities. It wasn't until a Thanksgiving parade last summer that I accidentally ran into Jacob and Veronica again. They had brought their kids, and I barely recognized the two at first. They looked so suburban. As Jacob's oldest son was waving a balloon around, I noticed Jacob staring at me from across the road. I figured enough time had passed that we could talk as adults, so we met up after the parade. It warmed my heart to see Veronica do so well. A few memories of her beautiful hair on my pillow next to me surfaced, and I felt this warmth in my chest. As she stepped away to help her kids use the restroom, Jacob approached me. He had this uneasy smile, something I'd never seen on him before. We shook hands, and his smile faded away. "You want to talk to her?" he asked. "No, I just wanted to see how you were doing. Long time no see, you know?" "You sure about that?" he chuckled, trying to diffuse the tension. "Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." No, said Jacob, nodding. "I get it. No worries, man. It's all history." He looked down on his hand, blinking. "But if it's okay with you," he continued, "I'd like for you to piss off and leave my wife alone." I want to say that was the last time I saw Jacob, but that wasn't the case. He added me on Facebook so he could stalk me. He'd send me long emails, talking at length about how he knew what I really felt for his beloved Veronica. It'd be these absurd, paranoid rants. He'd ask me about my dreams, about my intentions, even creepy private things like how long I'd touch myself while thinking about her. "That's my wife," he'd write. "I know how you feel about her, and I'll wring your fucking neck if I see you looking at her like that again." At first, I tried to calm him down, but after a while, I just started blocking him. Everything I said just made him worse, and I was honestly getting worried. I once saw him drive past my clinic in the middle of the day. Had he really taken time off work just to drive to the next town over to check on me? For what? To make sure I wasn't screwing his wife? He started leaving notes. He'd call me at work and send letters. He'd get new email addresses and get past my filters. I honestly considered calling the cops, and I told him as much. Huge mistake. A few months ago, I was out jogging down a nearby trail. I was listening to a lecture on 40s filmmakers and had blocked out most of the world. It's nice just to keep my mind busy. It helps me compartmentalize my anxiety. As I was passing by a broken streetlight, I suddenly felt a push. I was knocked forward, scraping my hands and knees on the pavement. Surprised, I just thought I tripped on something. As I turned, I realized I was being attacked. It was surreal seeing Jacob there. He wasn't wearing his reading glasses, and he just stared at me with the same unblinking eyes that Veronica used to get. In his right hand was a pistol, pointed in my direction. "Get up," he spat. "Now." 1,000 possibilities raced in my mind. I had to comply, but I also had to make an escape plan. I could feel my thoughts kicking into high gear, brain locking itself into running 100 possibilities at once. I just stood there opening and closing my mouth like a trout out of water. My brain was drowning in thoughts on dry land. "Step off the path," he continued. "Walk." Why are you doing this? You don't get to talk," he screamed. "You don't get that privilege. You get to step off the path, and you get to do what I say." I nodded and started walking. Jacob's hand was trembling. I could hear the rattle of the fully loaded magazine. We stepped off the trail and into the woods, stepping over logs, bushes, and zigzagging between saplings. It felt like an eternity. I'd been waiting for an opportunity to dive for cover, but at this range, it'd be impossible for him to miss me with all those bullets. One or two maybe, but a full magazine? There's no way. "I won't let you destroy my family," he said. "I know you want her back. You should have listened." "To what?" I asked. "You pursued me. I haven't done anything." "Don't you get it?" He laughed. "You don't see it?" He steadied his aim as I backed up. He was being smart, not aiming for the head. It'd be a body shot. One wrong move, and I'd be gone. It doesn't matter how many times you've imagined it. Facing down a barrel of a gun is like staring into a well of darkness, knowing that eternity waits to drag you to the bottom. I tried to force my mind to cooperate, to give me something, a solution, a calculation, something to guide me. Yet all that was left was insecurities, indecisiveness, and dread. This was real. This could be it. "Nothing fucking matters," Jacob continued. "You and I, we're just jokers in a deck stacked against us. There's an entire cosmos of evidence that just, it makes us." He screamed himself red, his eyes bloodshot and unblinking, refused to look away. "I should never have taken pity on you. I should have left you to suffer. But I just fucking feel you. You're in my goddamn head, opening these fucking doors. I don't want to think about these fucking things. I don't want to think about you taking her away from me. I don't want to think about how fucking dumb, small, and useless I am. Why does this keep coming back whenever you're in my mind?" "Jacob, No," he yelled, aiming down the sights. "No more fucking poison." I should have been dead. A bullet in the chest, left to die next to a birch sapling. That's what I anticipated, but that's not what happened. Had I gotten a better look, I would have noticed him sooner. A massive 540-pound black bear with a limp. Enraged. The moment Jacob raised his gun to take a shot, he was bowled over like a rotten log. I could briefly see his legs and head switch place as he was knocked flat on the ground. 2 shots went off, as a familiar roar echoed through the woods. The same roar I'd heard that night when a baby bear walked away from me, all those years ago. I saw the whole thing. I saw Jacob's arm ripped into pieces as the bear bore down on him. I saw him dragged across the forest as that enormous bear's jaws clamped down on his legs. I heard bones break as the bear stood up on his hind legs, only to push down with all his weight, biting, clawing, mauling, breaking, a body tossed around like a wet paper towel, spraying blood in all directions. Jacob's horrible screams just suddenly stopped with the snap of a joint, but the bear wasn't letting up. He was tearing him apart. This wasn't just an animal attack. This was retribution. I just slumped to my knees. The bear limped over to me, unscathed but covered in blood. The thought hit me that he might just be a wild animal attacking us or protecting his territory, but I knew that it wasn't. There was no way this wasn't Wojtek, and there was no way he'd hurt me. Instead, I leaned my sweaty forehead against his cold nose and cried. He nuzzled up against me. Over the years, his little yelping noises had turned into deep, comforting snorts. "I'm sorry," I bawled. "I'm so fucking sorry." Wojtek kept me company and felt my pain. Jacob's death was labeled as the result of a wild animal attack. Veronica had told the police about his deteriorating mental state, and a few locals had heard shots go off just as the bear roared. The conclusion was that he'd probably provoked the bear. I didn't say a thing. There was no need to try and explain my involvement. There was no way they'd believe me anyway. I've tried to summarize my thoughts about this. They're not rational, but I don't think there's anything rational about my life at this point. I think my mind is, somehow, contagious. I think my mood, my mindset, and my worries can spread. Animals don't really have the capacity to understand my anxieties, so they just pick up on my immediate intentions. They understand the basics. They don't need the rest. But people are complicated. I think Veronica picked up on my worries, social and otherwise. I think it caused some sort of short circuit in her ego. And Jacob, well, the first time I hugged him must have shocked his system with my thought of Veronica. Maybe that's what caused him to pursue her in the first place. Maybe seeing me again and shaking my hand reignited something that lay dormant for years. I don't know if I can trust myself around people. It's so much easier to write, to share things online. No one gets hurt. No one gets intrusive thoughts. You can just lean back and call bullshit on my story. I don't know what to do, how to move on. Can I even see a therapist? Either way, I think I'll be alone for now on. Then again, as I look to the woods, I know there are those who care. As a child, I was prone to waking up in the middle of the night. About once a week, my eyes would burst open as if something had awoken me, but there was never anything there. There were the echoes of a noise that I just couldn't recall, a silence that reminded me of something deafening, but no one else seemed to feel it. At first, I would simply try to return to sleep, but always found myself unable to. At some point, I would roll out of bed, pitter-patter down the hallway and try to wake up my brother so I wouldn't be alone in the night. No matter how much I yelled or shook, he would never wake up. Inevitably, I would find myself crawling into his bed and simply waiting what felt like hours until I would also return to sleep, comforted by his presence. I was just a little kid who looked up to his older brother, and I believed that he could protect me from anything, even in his sleep. As an adult, the problem persists. However, there is no one here to comfort me. I live on my own now, no family in the area, and no girlfriend in my life, but I still find myself waking up at least once a week. It is no longer to a silent sound that I can't recall, but rather to the sounds of a screaming baby just one house over. I don't mind it so much. I know it must be more of a hassle for the parents than for myself, but it can be tiresome. Instead of tossing and turning in bed, I brew myself some hot cocoa and add in just the smallest spike of Crown Royale whiskey. I'll then make my way to my computer chair, where I can enjoy an hour or two of some warm conversation on 4chan before the fuzzy feelings of sleep invited me back to bed. When I first awoke last night, I had no reason to think this was anything other than business as usual. If the baby had been crying, I seemed to have just missed it, but it wasn't something I gave much thought to. It was a bit earlier than usual, about 2 a.m., and I stayed at my computer until almost 6. I knew the sun would be coming up soon, and had already enjoyed 2 mugs of my spiked beverage. If I didn't return to bed then, there wouldn't be another chance until the sun went down. It was my day off, but I could only sleep in until about 9, as I had plans to meet my friend pretty early for a trip to the beach. I crawled into bed, pulled my covers up over me, and let myself be comforted by the waves of warmth. As was typical, I found myself rolling over here and there as I waited to succumb to my tiredness, occasionally opening my eyes to try and peek at the rising sun's light through my window, but it never came. Rolling around quickly became tossing and turning, and peeks at my windows became glances at my phone. By 7 a.m., I knew the sun should be up, but it wasn't until 8 that I knew something must be wrong. I had to wake up in about an hour anyway, so I figured I might as well get an early start and wake myself up with a shower. Before heading into the restroom, I stopped to look out the blinds of my window and was surprised to see that there wasn't even the crack of dawn in the distance. I mused over whether or not I had missed something important, as if I could drunkenly forget daylight savings in the dead of summer. The thought of it made me laugh, but when I returned from my long shower, I was no longer laughing. It was almost 9 a.m. now, but the sun still wasn't up. I flipped open my phone with frustration and began a Google search for my own local time, thinking that my Android's internal clock had simply messed up. But the internet showed the exact same thing I was seeing on my device, give or take a minute. This led me on a hunt across the house, checking every piece of technology I had, from the old watch at the bottom of my drawer, to my computer in my home office, to the time on my TV. Everything showed the exact same consistent time, now well into 9:30. When flipping through the channels on my television, everything seemed to still be playing late night. There was no early morning news, no talk shows, and no traffic or weather reports. Every station was playing classic Looney Tunes, syndicated Black family sitcoms, and the kind of infomercials people only witness when no one else is awake. Next, I took to the internet. I scoured every social media platform I could imagine. Facebook had updates, but they were only the kind that you would see late at night. The 3 a.m. thoughts of people who binged watched something into the morning and needed to simply put their voices out into the world to be acknowledged. I tried to acknowledge them. I tried to reply. I tried to like. I tried to share. But there were no reactions to my reaction. Then came the cell phones. It started with text, but I gave up fast on that. I began to call every single number I had, even hotlines and businesses, but no one ever answered. I left messages everywhere, begging them to talk to me, begging them to tell me what was going on. But no matter what I threw into the void, nothing ever returned. I even placed a call to my local police station, first the non-emergency line, but then I called 911 when I only found an answering machine, though in the end, I got the same message. After hours of harassing people online and on my phone, it was now well past noon. I had been checking the windows to see if anyone else woke up, but if they did, they never left their houses. I didn't blame them. I was scared too, but how else could I discover what was happening to everyone else? And so, I donned my shoes, put on a shirt, and made my way to the front door. There is something unsettling about trying to leave your house late at night, before midnight. It feels like there is nothing to worry about, but after then, it becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Despite the darkness, however, this wasn't night. It was now afternoon, though that only made it more intimidating to step out into the black. I considered bringing some sort of weapon, but going and knocking on neighbors' doors with a weapon in hand in the middle of the night probably wouldn't get me invited in. And so, I went into the streets and began knocking on doors. I began 2 doors down, where I was on relatively good terms with the man who lived there. We were the only two on the block who lived without families, just two single men in their smaller homes with spare rooms. There was an unspoken understanding between us that we reached out to each other first when in need of some help. Most of the families surrounding us had children, after all, and were less likely to have the time or resources to help. His name was Kenneth, and he had knocked on my door late one night when he needed a ride to the emergency room some months ago. He had hurt his hand pretty bad and didn't think he'd be able to handle a steering wheel. As such, I knew he would owe me an understanding reaction to me knocking on his door late at night. Except, he didn't answer the door. I tried knocking on his window and garage before giving up, but there was no response there either. I moved on to the next house between ours and immediately rang the doorbell. No answer. I walked up and down the block knocking, but there was never an answer. I gave up trying to be quiet, trying to only alert the person in the house, but I never heard a noise in return. Even the house next to mine returned nothing but silence when I began beating my fist against the door. I couldn't believe it. This family had an infant son who cried at all hours of the day, even in the dead of night. He seemed triggered by the slightest noises, and they had even asked me to turn down my television one night so as not to disturb him. Yet, he had no reaction tonight. I returned to Kenneth's house, this time ready to let myself in. Without a family to worry about, he was less likely to be on edge, assuming he was even inside, though I truly doubted it. I had a feeling that I was the only one left on our street, that everyone else had left or been evacuated, and I needed to prove it. His front door was locked, but he was definitely the kind of man to leave his back door open. I let myself in, not bothering to sneak around or tiptoe. I wanted to alert him of my presence if it turned out he was home. I made my way to the end of the house, fully expecting to find an empty bed in an empty room. But it wasn't empty. There he was, Kenneth, close to how I saw him, just sleeping in bed. His hair was a tad bit messier than usual, and it appeared he was naked if the discarded boxer shorts on the floor were any indication. But he was there, so I said his name. Then I yelled it. I went from soft to shouting in a matter of seconds, unable to understand why I didn't wake him up before with all my yelling and knocking. Even at this close proximity, he remained asleep, however. What if he isn't asleep? A chill ran through me as a thought entered my mind. I rushed to the side of his bed, not taking the time to rationalize the possibilities of what could have happened to him. I shook him. I screamed. I tried hitting him, but nothing woke him up. His heart beat faster and his breath became heavier, but nothing woke him up. Even opening his eyes had no effect. I practically threw him across the room in my attempt to break him out of his slumber, but he fell without any resistance. No change. He was a living corpse, unable to react to anything. But was he the only one? I made my way out of his house, grabbing a spare object on my way, a frying pan that Kenneth had left on the counter. I crossed his yard directly into our neighbors, to the family with the screaming baby that had now become silent, and began to smash at their sliding glass door. I tried to be cautious stepping in, but I couldn't bring myself to care too much. When I sliced some of my skin open on the glass, I just needed to get in. I needed to see the parents, the children, the dog, to see if any one of them would wake up, but none of them would. The parents shared their bed. Their daughters were tucked in, and just like Kenneth, they seemed unable to wake up. I made my way to a room at the end of the hall, one I knew must house their youngest son since he was the only one I hadn't seen yet. I shook and I shook and I shook, but the little boy wouldn't wake up. I wanted to take the frying pan and bash him with it, to dare him to move, to dare him to end this insane prank that the whole town seemed to be playing on me, to cry like he would every other night, but I stopped myself. Instead, I was the one who cried. It wasn't manly, it wasn't smart, but it was what I did. I just sat there in this little boy's room and cried, not knowing what else to do. Even calling the police had just led to an answering machine. What else was there? I was all alone in the dark of night. Except I wasn't. I heard a noise and froze. There was something else in the house. Then I heard the noise again. No, it wasn't in the house. It was in the room. And I recognized that sound. It was a sound I could never describe, the one that I could never remember. Yet somehow, it was also a noise I could never forget. It was the sound that woke me up each night, the sound that fades away as I return to consciousness, thinking I only imagined it in the silence. And it was in the room with me. I turned slowly to see the thing that made the sound behind me. It didn't look like a person, and yet, it wasn't a monster either. It was impossibly tall, with arms longer than its legs. It had to hunch to stop its head from pushing straight through the ceiling, and it smiled from ear to ear. No, that wasn't a smile. It didn't have cheeks or skin on its face. It just had teeth. Teeth that stretched from one ear to another to make it look like it was smiling. But it wasn't. It reached across the room from the little boy's closet, its fingers finding my face from almost a foot away from its palms, and it began to search it. It touched every muscle, every tendon, every pore, every cell in my skin as it explored my features as if it was blind. But it was staring right at me with those bright lights in its dark eyes. This was the thing that woke me up at night, the thing that woke up this little boy at night, that made him cry out in the darkness because of what he heard or perhaps even seen. I could feel it in his touch, his loneliness. It followed me, shrieking its strange shriek in the silence that somehow only I could hear, daring me to wake up, daring me to notice him. And I finally did. Today, it finally got me to look him in the eyes and share in the horror of the deafening shrieks it made with its teeth slammed together. Just then, the little boy woke up. He was barely more than a toddler and he began screaming, crying just like he did every other night. The creature in the closet turned away from me, its fingers no longer caring to explore my face, and instead, it focused on that poor little boy. I wanted to get in the way. I wanted to yell or scream or hit this monster with the frying pan, but I just ran. I ran from the room, from the house, from the street, and ran until I couldn't anymore. The baby stopped crying before I was out of earshot. I don't want to know what caused him to stop. I just hoped he was like everyone else, that he just went back to sleep. But I don't think that's how this works. It's now been over 24 hours. The sun was supposed to rise again, but I know it won't. In every house on every street I broke into, I found someone sleeping, but I didn't try to wake them. I didn't have to. I just knew that I had to keep checking to see if this was something that ended or something that just kept going forever. My tiredness comes and goes now. Sometimes I feel like I'm on the brink of passing out, and I welcome it. Then, I hear that thing shrieking in the distance, and I am brought back to a lucid state. No matter how far away I get, I can still hear it, and it's getting closer. As I write this, I am on the edge of town. I found an unlocked door and let myself in, needing to refreshen myself with a shower and some food. I doubt the owner will ever wake up, but in case he does, I'm writing this note for him and leaving it on his desktop. I wish I could write more, but I know that the creature is coming for me. I was quiet enough sneaking in here, but no matter how far I go or how quiet I am, it does seem to find a way to catch up with me. I have decided to steal this man's keys and take his car. I'm not proud of this action, but it seems to be the only way I'll be able to get to the next town over without crossing paths with that monstrosity again. I've decided to head north to my brother's town. I don't think he will be awake, but that's never been the case when I have sought his comfort in the night. Instead, I just hope to find him asleep. Perhaps if I spend the night in his bed, I'll fall asleep as well, as we did back when we were kids. At least, I hope so. If this message does manage to be found, I hope this story can help. On those nights where you're awake before the sun comes up, when you know something had to have woken you, but you find yourself surrounded only by silence, know that you aren't crazy, and whatever you do, go back to sleep if you can.